Welcome to episode 2 of Having Men for Dinner, presented by Marshfield United Methodist Church. I'm Reverend Kim Polchow. I'm the pastor here. I've been teaching this study based on the work of Nicole Wilkinson Duran for years, and I just think it's such an interesting model for understanding these stories of women murderers in the Bible. Plus, along the way, we can learn a lot of stuff that we can take forward into other kinds of Bible stories. Today, we're going to talk about the story of Jael. Jael's story is in Judges, chapters 4 and 5. And so we're going to go through the story. We're going to hear it. We're going to talk about how the model that Nicole Wilkinson Duran set up works within the story. And then we're going to go back and hear the story again and see what we've learned and how we interpret it, maybe with new ears after we've learned what we're going to learn. So here is the pattern. We'll review this that Duran uses to understand these stories. So first of all, you have to have a powerful male enemy in these stories. So you always see them. And we'll have a powerful foreign male enemy. And then we're going to have a particular situation with the husband. That's what I call it. He's not just in the other room. There's something up with the husband. There's going to be some sort of sexual tension. It can be overt. It can be covert. It can be hidden in language that maybe we're missing the tension in. That's the case with Jael today. Something that may be helpful to know going forward, and you're not likely to hear this in a sermon, in the Hebrew scriptures in the far past, women were often portrayed as sexual aggressors instead of men. You had to protect yourself if you were a man from the aggression of women who were seeking out partners. So that is a different perspective than we have in our culture today most of the time. So it's important to note that that's a thread that we sometimes have to pick up and weave into our understanding to understand what the Bible is saying. The next thing you have in this pattern is food or drink offered as hospitality. And then when you have all those pieces in place, we find a cold-blooded murder by a woman. Those things set the table, so to speak. So as we come into Jael, the second murderess of the Bible, she's somebody that we also seldom hear about. It's hard to preach the story of Jael. So unless you're taking Bible studies, you may have gone to church your whole life and never heard her story. But to understand Jael and her importance, we have to meet another woman of the Bible, Deborah. Deborah was a judge in Israel. She was a judge of Israel. A judge of Israel was not like judges of today. They did decide disputes, but they were also essentially the leaders of the community. Judges were a leader that God provided for a difficult time while the tribes of Israel were still tribes. So I'm going to put up an image of a timeline. This is something I've developed out of my study of the Bible, my study of Bible scholarship. I use this in all of my Bible studies, and I just sort of mark where we are in the timeline. And over time, my students, after taking several classes, start to become familiar with it and understand their biblical history timeline a little bit better. So this is before there was ever a king in Israel, but it's after the Exodus. The Israelites were settling into the promised land, Canaan, but even though the book of Joshua tells us that Israelites conquered that territory totally, the book of Judges comes back and tells us that there were repeat skirmishes and wars with the other people in the land, the Canaanites. So if you read Joshua, it's like the Canaanites disappear, but in Judges, they're still Canaanites. The people of Israel were still one huge family, traced back to the children of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, who was renamed Israel by God. If you've read Genesis, you're going to know some of this. If you don't know it, hey, it's a good time to go back and read from Genesis chapter 12 forward through the book, because those are going to be the stories of the matriarchs and the patriarchs that undergird the period of the Judges. At the time of Judges, Israel was essentially a loose confederation of tribes that kept turning back from the ways of God. The book of Judges follows a very particular cycle. So step 1 is the people sin against God. And step 2 is an enemy comes to punish them. Now, if you watched episode 1 where we talked about Judith, you may remember that Judith told Holofernes that Israel had this sort of weakness, that they could only be conquered if they had sinned against God. So this is sort of a reference back to the story of Jael, which is an older story than Judith. So it's that idea that they sin against God and then an enemy is allowed to come punish them. Then the people repent and they turn to God for help, followed by God raising up a judge to lead them through their struggles. Following the rise of the judge, then there's peace. And then the judge dies, which returns us to the beginning. It's a cycle. And so then the people don't have a leader. They're going to sin against God, and we're going to start it all over again. This goes on and on through the book of Judges until Israel gets a king, which is described in 1 Samuel. And I talk about that in an upcoming Bible study on the United Monarchy, the rise of David. We'll talk about that. So now this is kind of a big thing. If you've listened to all of this, now you understand why the book of Judges seems so repetitive, and you can go read it and maybe make a little more sense because you know the pattern, right? And patterns help us understand things. There are a lot of patterns in the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament. And if we know those things, then it can help our minds make sense of what we're reading, and we can become better interpreters of the Bible. So let's talk about the first judge. His name was Ehud, and he killed the king of Moab in this gruesome way rather than beating him in battle. He basically asked for a private meeting with the king, and then he assassinated him while the courtiers thought he was in the bathroom, kinda. But then Ehud died, and the Israelites started worshiping other gods because that's our cycle. And they sinned against God, and God sent Jabin, king of the Canaanites, against them, right? That's their understanding is they sinned, and God sent someone to punish them. His armies, King Jabin's armies, were led by a general named Sisera. Sisera is our powerful foreign male enemy in the story of Jael. And God raised up a judge in the form of Deborah, a prophet. Deborah also had a general whose name was Barak. One of the more distant cousins of the Israelites, Heber, a Kenite, who was related to the Israelites through being a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law, decided he was not going to stay with his Israelite family. His immediate family had some connection to the king of the Canaanites, Jabin. So he moved his tent and his wife toward the Canaanites, effectively turning his back on the Israelites. But the Israelites won. Barak, the general for Deborah's Israel, defeated the Canaanites soundly, killing all the men except their general, Sisera, who escaped to the tent of Heber the Kenite. You remember that guy? Yeah. When he reached the tent, when Sisera reached Heber's tent, Heber was not there, but his wife Jael was. So we're going to hear that story directly from Judges 4. So for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, there's a document in the show notes that's going to have the readings on there, and this is in that document. This is Judges 4, 18 to 24. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is any man in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple, which might more accurately be translated lips, it's unsure, into the ground, and he died. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his head, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of the Canaanites, until they destroyed him. So, that's the end of Jael's direct story in Scripture. The story then gets retold in Judges 5 in the Song of Deborah. Now, if you watched the first episode that was about Judith, you remember that we had all the action, and then we had this Song of Judith. So this is a regular construction in the Hebrew Scriptures where something glorious happens, and then somebody sings a song of praise to God, and we get that Song of Deborah, Song of Judith. So this is the Song of Deborah, as Deborah and the people praise Jael for her courage, and they welcome her back into the fold of Israel. So this is from Judges 5, 24-30. Deborah sings, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed of tent-dwelling women, he asked for a water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank. He fell. There he lay. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell. Dead." All those words are really in there. "Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, 'Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?' The wisest of her ladies answer her. Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, 'Are they not finding and dividing the spoils, a woman or two for each man? Colorful garments as plunder for Sisera, colorful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck. All this is plunder.'" There's some poetic parallelism in there. So let's take a look at the pattern of these women murdering stories and talk about how this story, the story of Jael, fits the pattern. So first of all, a powerful foreign male enemy. I've already told you that's Sisera the general. A particular situation with the husband. Yeah, so he's absent, and he's the one that moved the tent. And it could be perceived as sort of traitorous, but also didn't it sort of put Jael in the right spot at the right time? It's interesting. And then, is there some sort of sexual tension? And we'll come back to the sexual tension later, because the sexual tension piece is super complicated in this story. And then food or drink offered as hospitality. He asks for water, and she opens a skin of milk and gives him milk, which is disturbingly maternal. Last, we have a cold-blooded murder by a woman. Judith tent pegs him to the floor through the mouth or the temple. So let's go back to the issue of sexual tension in this story. There's something maybe euphemistic going on. The tent was a woman's sphere. You remember Judith, when she was sad, she was grieving, she put a tent on the top of her house and she lived in the tent. So a tent is a woman's sphere. There's a reference back to the time when they were nomads. The women were in charge of the tents. Jael put the tent together. She took care of it. She dwelled inside it. Inviting a man into her tent was a very intimate thing. The tent itself sometimes represents a woman. So she invites him into her sphere herself with promises of shelter. She nurtures him, and then she murders him in his sleep. When I lived in China, sometimes a guy would disappear and you'd ask, where did he go? And they would say, he's picking flowers, which was a euphemism for using the restroom. The Bible has a euphemism for basically something involving a man's parts, all right, covering his feet. So in Judges 3, for example, Ehud, that's the story I started with, the story of the first judge of Israel. So in Judges 3, Ehud has murdered the king of Moab, but his people think he's relieving himself in modern translations. But the Hebrew says he was covering his feet. Likewise, in the story of Ruth, Ruth goes to Boaz at night. She lays at the foot of his pallet on the threshing floor and covers his feet. And then they wake up in the morning and he sees his feet have been covered and suddenly they're getting married. So I'll just leave that there, right? This text does not say Jael covered his feet, but it does make the point twice that she covered him up. She covered him with something. And that typically means something else in the Bible. It's typically some sort of euphemistic thing involving a man. So at least invites you to think that she was caring for him intimately inside her tent, which was an intimate thing. Like a child or a lover, she has taken responsibility for all of him. So there's nothing overtly sexual here, but it all serves to emphasize his complete vulnerability to her. In many ways, they have reversed expected gender roles. She becomes the inviter, the provider, the decider, the killer, the victor. She actually went out and met him and invited him into the tent. When he asks for water, she turns the tables. She gives him milk. She is in control of this situation. When he gives her instructions to watch over him, in the Hebrew, he uses masculine forms of the words, as if she is a he, and he tells her if someone asks if there's any guy there, she is to say no. So there's definite playing with gender roles going on here. And maybe these boundary crossings, these reversal of roles, are why Jael is such a despised woman of the Bible. If you find a list of the bad girls of the Bible, Jael will certainly be near the top of it. And yet that's such a double standard. There's a real double standard at work if we choose to vilify Jael. As I mentioned during our brief discussion of judges, the first judge was Ehud, who killed the king of the Ammonites in a particularly disgusting way. And for larks, I looked up Ehud on a popular Bible website. I do stuff like this sometimes. And I found very little except that he assassinated the king of the Moabites. But when I looked up Jael, I found the following statements in a popular Zondervan published book on the women of the Bible. Jael did not kill Sisera as David did Goliath, a champion of the Lord bent on destroying his arch enemies. While divine judgment fell upon Sisera, Jael erred in that she did not allow God to designate the means of punishment. Perhaps she felt an irresistible impulse to slay the persistent enemy of God's people, but she remains forever censorable for the cruel way she killed Sisera, even though Deborah gloated over the act and praised it in poetic form. Not only is Jael a horrible, forever censorable person, but so is Deborah for seeing that it was great that she killed their enemy. Whatever. Now, let me just say that I would not ask Jael to babysit my child. Clearly, right? She's not safe gathering certifiable. But the Bible is filled with unspeakable cruelty of men towards other men and women and children, and yet we seldom find criticism of their violence if the violence served the interests of Israel, and therefore of God. This commentary also said Jael had no conception that she was the one person at the opportune moment to render stern justice on an enemy of God. How do they know that? I mean, there's no Bible scholarship that would tell you that. It's just because God can't talk to women. Please, a man wrote that. I don't understand it. We have to be careful when we're ready to tar and feather women like Judith, Jael, and Esther, who will be our next episode. And when we label them bad girls of the Bible, that's a judgment. And when we let these kinds of double standards become standard, the story of Judith raises up Judith as the epitome of Jewish women. The story of Jael ends with this. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. Not on that day, despite the cowardly acts of this woman who acted against God's will, God still managed to subdue the Canaanites. No, we are against murder, clearly, but when we vilify these women as murderers, while seeing nothing of the men of the Bible who murdered, and they're considered heroes. We're putting more gender bias into the scripture than there is. And that is very, very dangerous. So now that we've walked through this model, Duran's model, and we've talked about some of what's going on in the text, I want to close this part out by hearing the story again and see if your understanding of the story has changed. So we're going to take it straight from Judges 4. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple or lips into the ground, and he died. Just then, Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I'll show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. And the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. That's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about interpretation, and gender, and art, and culture, and reflect a little bit on what we've learned so far and how we might be looking at things in the Bible with new eyes.